In June of 1662, a man died in Paris who'd spent his entire life caught between two worlds. He was a mathematical genius who abandoned mathematics for God, a scientist who rejected science for faith, a man who invented the calculator, the bus system, and probability theory, then threw it all away because he believed none of it mattered. His final words were not about his discoveries or his theorems. They were about grace. Blaise Pascal lived only 39 years, but those years contained enough brilliance and torment for several lifetimes. He solved problems that had stumped mathematicians for centuries, then declared that all such problems were meaningless distractions. He designed experiments that helped create modern physics, then announced that physics couldn't touch what truly mattered. He wrote one of the most influential books in Christian history, and he never meant to publish it at all. Most people know Pascal's name from a wager. You've probably heard it. If God exists and you believe, you gain everything. If God exists and you don't believe, you lose everything. Therefore, you should believe. It's clever. It's logical. And Pascal himself would probably tell you, it's not the point. The real Pascal is stranger and more compelling than the tidy philosophical argument that bears his name. Here was someone who could see patterns in numbers that no one else could perceive, who could construct logical proofs of extraordinary elegance, who had one of the sharpest minds in European history. And that same mind became convinced that all of this, all the brilliance and discovery, was ultimately worthless compared to a single moment of religious experience. We're going to follow Pascal from a childhood marked by illness and an obsessive father, through the years when he seemed destined to become the greatest mathematician of his generation, to the night that changed everything. We'll watch him invent things that wouldn't be properly appreciated for centuries. We'll see him caught between the Jesuits and the Jansenists in religious controversies that could get you killed, and we'll watch as his body slowly failed him, while his mind raced faster and faster toward conclusions that still make people uncomfortable. This isn't a story about someone who had it all figured out. It's about someone brilliant enough to see the limits of brilliance itself. Blaise Pascal was born on June 19, 1623, in Clermont-Ferrand, a town in central France you've probably never heard of unless you're really into volcanic plateaus or cheese. His father, Etienne Pascal, was a local judge, a man of some standing in the community. More importantly for our story, Etienne was a mathematician himself, not a professional one, but someone who understood numbers and loved them. Blaise's mother, Antoinette, died when he was 3 years old. We know almost nothing about her except that she left behind 3 children, Gilberte, the eldest, Blaise, and Jacqueline, the youngest. The loss of their mother meant everything that followed was shaped by their father's decisions alone. Etienne Pascal was not a typical parent, even by 17th century standards. He had ideas about education that were unusual, to put it mildly. He believed that children learned best when they were ready, not according to some arbitrary schedule. He thought that forcing subjects on young minds before they could appreciate them would ruin their natural curiosity. So when Blaise showed an early aptitude for mathematics, Etienne made a strange choice. He forbade the boy from studying it. Think about that for a moment. Your child shows talent in your own field, demonstrates unusual ability, and you ban them from learning about it. Etienne's reasoning was that Blaise needed to master languages first, particularly Latin and Greek, the foundation of all educated discourse in that era. Mathematics could wait. It would still be there when the boy was older. This might have worked with a normal child. Blaise was not normal. Denied access to mathematical texts, forbidden from studying geometry or arithmetic formally, Blaise began to figure it out himself. In his father's study, probably around age 12, he started drawing figures on the floor with charcoal. Circles, triangles, lines intersecting at angles. He didn't know the proper terms. He called a circle a round and a line a bar, but he began working through geometric principles from scratch, rediscovering proofs that had first been developed 2,000 years earlier, when Etienne walked in and found his son recreating Euclidean geometry on the floor without having read Euclid. He reportedly wept. The ban was lifted immediately. What happened next was unusual, even for a mathematical prodigy. Blaise didn't just study mathematics, he devoured it, and by 14, he was attending meetings of the most sophisticated mathematical minds in Paris. In 1631, Etienne Pascal had moved the family to Paris. He'd gotten into some political trouble back in Clermont, the kind of trouble that involved criticizing Cardinal Richelieu's tax policies. This was not a smart move in 1620s France. Richelieu was effectively running the country, and he didn't take criticism lightly. So the Pascals relocated to Paris, where Etienne kept a lower profile and Blaise found himself in a very different world. Paris in the 1630s was experiencing what historians would later call the scientific revolution, though nobody called it that at the time. They just thought they were arguing about geometry. Marin Mersenne, a minim friar and mathematician, hosted regular gatherings where the best minds in France would meet to discuss mathematical and scientific problems. These weren't formal academic sessions. They were more like intellectual salons, except instead of discussing poetry or philosophy, these men were arguing about conic sections and the nature of vacuum. Etienne Pascal became a regular attendee, and he started bringing his teenage son along. The other participants must have found it strange at first, this boy sitting quietly in the corner while grown men debated. Then Blaise started contributing to the discussions. By 16, he'd written a treatise on conic sections that impressed even René Descartes, the most famous philosopher and mathematician in France. Descartes was so impressed, in fact, that he initially refused to believe a 16-year-old had written it. He assumed Etienne must have done the work and put his son's name on it. The treatise was called Essay on Conics, and most of it is lost now. Only one copy survived, a single page outlining the main theorem, which has come to be known as Pascal's theorem. It states that if you inscribe a hexagon in a conic section, the 3 points where opposite sides intersect will always lie on a straight line. If that sentence made your eyes glaze over, you're not alone. But here's what matters. This was new. This was something that the ancient Greek geometers hadn't known, and it opened up an entire field of investigation that mathematicians would explore for the next 3 centuries. Blaise was 17 years old. Then everything stopped. In 1638, Etienne Pascal found himself in serious trouble again. He'd publicly opposed another of Richelieu's financial policies, this time involving government bonds. It was the kind of opposition that could land you in the Bastille if you weren't careful. Etienne had to go into hiding. For months, the family didn't know where he was or whether he was safe. Jacqueline, the youngest Pascal daughter, was only 13, but already showing remarkable theatrical talent. She performed in a play at the royal court, and her performance so delighted Cardinal Richelieu that he asked what favour he could grant her. She asked for her father's pardon. Richelieu agreed, but with conditions. Etienne would be forgiven, but he'd have to leave Paris. He was appointed as a royal tax commissioner in Rouen, a port city in Normandy. It was technically a promotion, but everyone understood it was also exile. The family moved to Rouen in 1639. Blaise was 16. His brief time at the centre of Parisian mathematical society was over, and ahead lay years in a provincial city dealing with tax collection. You might think this would be where the story of Blaise Pascal's genius comes to an end, buried under the tedious work of calculating taxes in Normandy. Instead, it's where he invented the computer. Not exactly a computer as we'd recognise it, but the mechanical calculator that Pascal designed and built between 1642 and 1644, the Pascaline, was something entirely new in the world. It could add and subtract automatically through a system of gears and wheels. You'd input numbers using dials, turn a handle, and the machine would calculate the result. He built it to help his father, who spent endless hours doing arithmetic to track tax revenues. Etienne's eyes were failing from the strain of adding up columns of numbers by hand. Blaise thought he could solve this problem mechanically. The first prototype didn't work. Neither did the second, or the third. Over the next several years, Pascal built more than 50 versions of his calculating machine, each one an attempt to solve the problems revealed by the last. The main challenge was creating a mechanism that could carry digits, that could automatically add 1 to the next column when a column reached 10. He eventually solved it using a weight-driven system that would engage at the right moment. The Pascaline worked. It wasn't fast and it was expensive to produce, but it worked. Pascal tried to commercialize it, even got a royal privilege, essentially a patent, from the king. But the machines were too costly to manufacture and too complex for most people to operate. Only about 20 were ever made. The Pascaline was a commercial failure, but it was also 3 centuries ahead of its time. The principles Pascal developed, the way he thought about breaking arithmetic down into mechanical operations, anticipated everything from the difference engine to the modern computer. Charles Babbage would later acknowledge Pascal as an inspiration. While building calculating machines in Rouen, Pascal was also continuing his mathematical work. He corresponded with other mathematicians, particularly Pierre de Fermat, about problems in geometry and number theory. These weren't casual letters. They were detailed mathematical arguments, theorems being developed through the mail, and then Pascal discovered physics, or rather, physics discovered him. In 1646, news reached Rouen of an experiment being conducted in Italy. Evangelista Torricelli, a student of Galileo, had taken a glass tube, filled it with mercury, inverted it into a basin of mercury, and watched as the mercury in the tube fell to a certain level and stopped. Above the mercury in the tube was empty space. This was shocking. The conventional scientific wisdom inherited from Aristotle held that nature abhors a vacuum. Empty space couldn't exist. The universe would rush in to fill it. Torricelli's experiment suggested otherwise. The space above the mercury really was empty, a vacuum. The mercury stayed at a particular height because of the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on the basin. Most scientists were skeptical. They proposed elaborate alternative explanations. Maybe there was invisible matter filling that space. Maybe the glass was somehow pulling the mercury up. Anything but accepting that a vacuum could exist. Pascal became obsessed with the question. If Torricelli was right, if the atmosphere really had weight pressing down, then the pressure should be less at higher altitudes. There should be less atmosphere above you. The mercury should rise higher in the tube. Rouen wasn't ideal for testing this. You need a mountain. But Pascal had family in Clermont-Ferrand, and Clermont-Ferrand had the Puy de Dôme, a volcanic peak rising over 4,800 feet above the surrounding plateau. In 1648, Pascal convinced his brother-in-law, Florent Perrier, to carry a barometer, essentially Torricelli's apparatus, to the summit of the Puy de Dôme and measure the height of the mercury column at different altitudes. Perrier did, and the results were exactly what Pascal had predicted. At the base of the mountain, the mercury stood at a certain height. At the summit, it was measurably lower. The atmospheric pressure had decreased. This wasn't just confirming Torricelli. This was demonstrating something fundamental about how the world works. That air has weight, that pressure decreases with altitude, that vacuums can exist. Pascal had helped establish the foundations of what would become fluid mechanics and barometric measurements. He was 25 years old, and he'd already contributed more to mathematics and science than most people contribute in a full career. But something else happened in 1646 that would prove far more consequential than any experiment or theorem, something that would eventually lead Pascal to abandon science altogether. The Pascal family discovered Jansenism. The man who came to their door in 1646 was a doctor. His name was Deschamps, and he'd been called to Rouen to treat Etienne Pascal, who had fallen and injured himself on the ice. The treatment was successful, but something else happened during those weeks of recovery. Deschamps wasn't just a physician, he was a devoted Jansenist, and he talked about his faith with the same precision and passion that the Pascals brought to mathematics. Jansenism was named after Cornelius Jansen, a Dutch theologian who had died in 1638. His posthumously published work, Augustinus, argued for a return to what Jansen believed was authentic Christianity, stripped of the compromises and corruptions that had accumulated over centuries. It was Catholicism, but barely recognizable to most Catholics. The Jansenists rejected free will, as most people understood it. They believed in absolute predestination. God had chosen before the beginning of time who would be saved and who would be damned. Nothing you could do would change that. Your fate was sealed before you were born. This sounds bleak. It was bleak. But the Jansenists found in it a kind of fierce hope. If salvation came only from God's grace, freely given to the undeserving, then human pride and human achievement meant nothing. The powerful and the weak stood equal before divine judgment. And if your salvation was assured, if you were among the elect, then you could live with absolute moral purity, knowing that God's grace would sustain you. The centre of Jansenist thought in France was Port-Royal, an abbey about 30 miles southwest of Paris. It had become a refuge for intellectuals and aristocrats who'd embraced this austere, demanding faith. They lived simply, prayed constantly, and produced some of the most sophisticated theological writing of the age. Blaise Pascal listened to Deschamps and was transformed. He became a committed Jansenist, and he brought his family with him. Jacqueline embraced the new faith immediately, finding in its severity something that matched her own spiritual intensity. Blaise was more cautious, but he too was drawn. The Pascal household changed. The focus on worldly achievement, on science and mathematics, and mechanical invention began to seem less important. What mattered was the state of your soul, your relationship with God, your preparation for the judgment that awaited all human beings, regardless of their accomplishments. For now, Blaise continued his scientific work. The experiments with atmospheric pressure, the correspondence with other mathematicians, the tinkering with calculating machines. But something had shifted. A tension was developing between the brilliant young scientist and the devout believer he was becoming. That tension would eventually tear him apart, but not yet. In 1647, the Pascal family moved back to Paris. Etienne had served his time as tax commissioner in Rouen, and there was no longer any reason to stay. They took a house in the Marais, then one of Paris's most fashionable neighbourhoods. Blaise was 24, already famous in scientific circles, already corresponding with the greatest minds of the age. Paris gave him access to something Rouen couldn't provide: intellectual community. The universities were conservative and hostile to new ideas, but outside the universities, in the salons and private gatherings of interested amateurs and serious scholars, something remarkable was happening. People were meeting to discuss mathematics, physics, philosophy. They were sharing observations, debating theories, building on each other's work. One of these circles was organised by Marin Mersenne, a minime friar who turned his monastic cell into something like the headquarters of European science. Mersenne corresponded with everyone. He knew what Galileo was doing in Italy, what Descartes was thinking in the Netherlands, what Fermat was proving in Toulouse. He brought people together, facilitated exchanges, ensured that discoveries made in one place reached interested minds in others. Mersenne welcomed Pascal immediately. Here was exactly the kind of brilliant young mind the circle existed to cultivate. Through Mersenne, Pascal met the scientists and philosophers who would become his colleagues and sometimes his adversaries for the rest of his working life. One of them was René Descartes. Descartes was 51 in 1647, at the height of his powers and his fame. He'd revolutionized philosophy with his method of systematic doubt, his famous "I think therefore I am." He'd developed a new approach to geometry that would eventually bear his name: Cartesian coordinates. He'd proposed mechanical explanations for everything from the circulation of the blood to the formation of planets. He was also arrogant, prickly, and increasingly isolated. He'd left France years earlier and was living in the Netherlands, away from the theological controversies that might threaten him. But he still visited Paris occasionally, and Mersenne arranged for him to meet Pascal. The meeting did not go well. Descartes arrived at the Pascal house expecting to meet a promising but still forming young mind, someone who might benefit from his guidance. What he found instead was a fully mature scientist with his own methods and his own conclusions, some of which contradicted Descartes' own work. They argued about the vacuum. Descartes insisted that true empty space was impossible. What Pascal called a vacuum was actually filled with subtle matter too fine to detect. Pascal countered with his experimental evidence. The barometer experiments couldn't be explained away with invisible substances. The mercury rose and fell predictably based on altitude. The simplest explanation was that air had weight and that empty space could exist. Descartes was not persuaded. He left the meeting convinced that Pascal was talented but misguided, pursuing experiments when he should be developing theories. Pascal was equally unimpressed. The great Descartes seemed more interested in defending his system than in following evidence wherever it led. The encounter revealed something important about Pascal's approach to knowledge. He wasn't a pure theorist like Descartes, building elaborate philosophical systems from first principles, but he wasn't a pure experimentalist either, simply collecting observations. He moved between theory and experiment, using each to inform the other. He'd develop a hypothesis, test it, refine it based on results, test again. It was the method that would eventually become the foundation of modern science. But in 1647, it was still unusual. The vacuum experiments continued. Pascal published his results in 1647 in a work called New Experiments Concerning Vacuums. The response was immediate and hostile. Established scientists, particularly those who followed Aristotelian principles, attacked Pascal's conclusions. A Jesuit named Etienne Noel wrote an elaborate refutation. Father Noel was an intelligent man and a skilled rhetorician. His arguments were sophisticated. They were also wrong. Pascal responded with devastating precision. He didn't just defend his experiments, he exposed the logical flaws in Noel's reasoning, showed how Noel's alternative explanations required assumptions far more complex than simply accepting that vacuums exist. It was a masterclass in scientific argument, but the controversy exhausted him. Pascal's health, never robust, began deteriorating. He suffered from severe headaches, stomach problems, and what he described as a weakness in his legs that made walking difficult. Modern doctors reading his symptoms have suggested everything from brain tumours to chronic migraines to psychosomatic illness brought on by stress. Whatever the physical cause, there was certainly a psychological component. Pascal was caught between worlds. He was a brilliant scientist at the beginning of his career, with discoveries still to make and battles still to fight. But he was also a Jansenist, increasingly convinced that worldly achievement meant nothing, that the life of the mind was a distraction from the only thing that truly mattered: salvation. For several years, Pascal tried to maintain both commitments. He continued his mathematical work, but with less intensity. He attended Mersenne's gatherings, but talked as much about theology as about physics. He was searching for a way to reconcile his faith with his intellect, to find a form of Christianity that didn't require him to abandon reason. He thought he'd found it. Jansenism, with its emphasis on God's absolute sovereignty, had a kind of logical purity that appealed to his mathematical mind. If you accepted the initial premises, everything else followed with geometric necessity. And the Jansenists valued learning. Port Royal was full of scholars. They didn't see faith and intellect as opposed. They saw faith as the proper use of intellect, reason turned toward its highest object. But there was always tension, always the suspicion that spending time on mathematics meant spending less time on God. Always the question of whether scientific fame might be a form of pride, the worst of sins. In 1651, Etienne Pascal died. He was 63. He'd lived long enough to see both his children achieve remarkable things. Jacqueline had become known for her poetry, though she was increasingly drawn toward religious life. Blaise had become one of the most celebrated scientists in Europe. Etienne died proud, but perhaps also worried. He'd raised his children to excel, but had he raised them to be saved? His death hit Blaise hard. The two had been close. Etienne had recognized his son's genius early and had dedicated himself to nurturing it. He taught Blaise his first mathematics. He'd taken him to Mersenne gatherings. He'd moved the family to Rouen to take a position that would support Blaise's education and work. Now he was gone. And with him went one of the last anchors keeping Blaise connected to the world of science and society. Jacqueline felt it too. Within months of their father's death, she announced that she wanted to enter Port Royal as a nun. She wanted to leave behind her literary fame, her family connections, everything that tied her to worldly life. She wanted to devote herself entirely to God. Blaise reacted with fury, not because he opposed religious life in principle. He was a committed Jansenist himself. But Jacqueline was his closest companion, the person who understood him best. Her departure would leave him alone. He tried to stop her. He argued that she was needed at home, that their father's estate required management, that she was acting rashly. She waited 2 years, partly out of respect for her brother's wishes, partly because Port Royal itself hesitated to accept someone from such a prominent family. The Jansenists were already under suspicion from church authorities. Taking in the sister of a famous mathematician might draw unwanted attention. But in 1653, Jacqueline entered Port Royal. She took the name Sister Sainte-Euphémie. She would live there for the rest of her life, which would not be long. Blaise was left alone in Paris. He was 30 years old. He'd accomplished more than most people accomplish in a lifetime. And he was miserable. The headaches were worse. The stomach problems constant. He couldn't work for more than brief periods without exhausting himself. His friends from the scientific community still invited him to gatherings, but he attended less frequently. What was the point? He began to think seriously about abandoning science altogether, not because he'd lost interest, but because he'd become convinced that it was a distraction from what truly mattered. Mathematics, physics, all the questions that had consumed him for 15 years suddenly seemed trivial compared to the question of salvation. But he wasn't quite ready to let go. Not yet. What followed was what Pascal would later call his worldly period. He didn't abandon religion. He continued to pray, to attend Mass, to consider himself a Christian. But he stepped back from the severe demands of Jansenism. He allowed himself to enjoy life a little. He frequented the salons of Paris where aristocrats and intellectuals gathered to discuss philosophy, literature, and current affairs. He made new friends among the nobility. He even developed a social circle around gambling and games of chance, spending evenings calculating odds and developing strategies. This might seem like a fall from grace. Pascal himself would later describe these years with shame. But something remarkable was happening. By studying gambling, Pascal was developing the mathematical theory of probability, and that theory would lead him to an argument about faith that still resonates today. The mathematics of gambling revealed something that no one had seen before. When you throw dice or draw cards, there's a pattern beneath the chaos, a structure that can be measured, analysed, predicted. Not with certainty, never with certainty, but with something almost as useful, with probability. Pascal wasn't the first to notice this. Girolamo Cardano, the Italian polymath, had written about gambling odds a century earlier, but Cardano's work was scattered, unsystematic, more like a gambler's notebook than a mathematical treatise. What Pascal did, working with Pierre de Fermat through a series of letters in 1654, was transform these scattered observations into a genuine theory. The problem they focused on became famous. The problem of points. 2 players are gambling, they're interrupted before finishing their game. How should the stakes be divided fairly based on who's ahead. It sounds simple. It's not, because you're not dividing what has happened. You're dividing what might happen. You're calculating the value of uncertain futures. Pascal and Fermat solved it. They developed methods for calculating expected values, for weighing possibilities, for making rational decisions in the face of uncertainty. They created, essentially, the mathematics of hope and fear, the calculus of risk. And then Pascal had an idea that would haunt theology for the next 4 centuries. What if you applied this mathematical thinking not to dice and cards, but to the ultimate gamble? The question of God's existence? You can't prove God exists. Pascal knew this. The philosophers had tried for centuries, constructing elaborate arguments from first principles, and none of them were truly convincing. You also can't prove God doesn't exist. The atheists were equally unable to establish their position with certainty. So you're stuck. You have to choose. Believe or don't believe. Live as if God exists or live as if he doesn't. There's no third option, no way to avoid making a choice, because even refusing to decide is itself a decision. This is a wager, and like any wager, it can be analysed mathematically. Consider the possible outcomes. If you believe in God and God exists, you gain infinite reward. Eternal happiness. If you believe in God and God doesn't exist, you lose finite pleasures. Some earthly comforts and freedoms given up for nothing. If you don't believe in God and God exists, you lose infinite punishment. Eternal damnation. If you don't believe in God and God doesn't exist, you gain finite pleasures. The earthly comforts and freedoms you kept. Now calculate the expected value. Even if the probability that God exists is tiny, infinitesimally small, multiplying that tiny probability by infinite reward still yields infinity. The mathematics is clear. You should bet on God. Pascal's wager, as it came to be called, was ingenious and troubling in equal measure. Ingenious because it bypassed centuries of failed proofs and approached faith from an entirely new angle. Troubling because it seemed to reduce belief to a calculated gamble, a hedging of bets, something mercenary and cold. The critics pounced immediately, and they've never stopped. Which God are you wagering on? If you pick the wrong religion, you might end up worse off than the atheist. And doesn't God want genuine faith, not calculated self-interest? Would a God worth believing in accept worship motivated by a probability calculation? Pascal knew these objections. The wager wasn't his final word on faith. It was a door opener, a way to make the skeptic consider that perhaps refusing to believe wasn't as rational as they thought. Once that door opened, other considerations could enter. Experience, testimony, the transformation that faith produced in people's lives. But there was something deeper happening in Pascal's thinking, something that went beyond clever argumentation. He was beginning to see that the split between reason and faith, between mathematics and religion, wasn't as clean as he'd assumed. Both dealt with uncertainty, both required leaps, both demanded that you act without complete knowledge. The scientist making a hypothesis was wagering just as much as the believer. The mathematician accepting an axiom was taking a leap of faith, and the person living without God was gambling whether they acknowledged it or not. This realization was crystallizing at exactly the moment when Pascal's health was deteriorating further, and his sister Jacqueline was writing him increasingly urgent letters from Port Royal. She begged him to return fully to his faith, to stop wasting his gifts on worldly pursuits, to recognize that God was calling him. He wasn't ready, not yet. In the spring of 1654, Pascal was still dividing his time between mathematics, gambling theory, and Parisian society. He'd made a name for himself in aristocratic circles. He was charming when he wanted to be, brilliant always, and his friendship with the Duc de Rohannet, a wealthy nobleman interested in mathematics and philosophy, gave him access to the highest social circles. They spent evenings discussing geometry, probability, and theological questions. They attended the theatre, they travelled together. For a brief period, Pascal seemed to have found a balance between his intellectual pursuits and the social world, but something was wrong. He knew it. His friends knew it. The headaches that had plagued him since childhood were intensifying. His stomach problems made eating difficult. He couldn't sleep properly. The doctors prescribed the usual remedies of the era, which meant bloodletting, purges, and various herbal concoctions that probably made things worse. More troubling than the physical symptoms was a growing sense of emptiness. The salons that had seemed so stimulating now felt hollow. The mathematical problems that had once consumed him completely now seemed like distractions. Even the wager, brilliant as it was, felt inadequate, cold, calculated. He needed something more than probability theory could provide, something beyond what human reason could reach. On November 23rd, 1654, something happened. Pascal never fully explained what, but that night changed everything. He was alone in his rooms. It was late, after 10 in the evening. He was thinking, praying, reading scripture perhaps, and then for approximately 2 hours, he experienced something that shattered the careful, intellectual framework he'd built around his faith. It wasn't a vision exactly. It wasn't voices. It was a presence, an overwhelming certainty, a fire. He grabbed paper and wrote frantically, trying to capture what was happening to him, knowing even as he wrote that words couldn't contain it. Fire, he wrote. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and scholars. The distinction was crucial. The God he encountered wasn't the abstract first cause of the philosophers, the logical necessity at the end of an argument. It was the living God who called to Moses from the burning bush, who spoke to prophets, who became incarnate, a God who could be experienced, not just deduced. Certitude, feeling, joy, peace, God of Jesus Christ. The experience lasted 2 hours. When it ended, Pascal was transformed, not gradually, not through careful reasoning, but instantly. The mathematical proofs, the clever arguments, the wager itself, all of it suddenly seemed beside the point. He had met God. Nothing else mattered. He took the paper on which he'd written his fragmentary account of the experience and sewed it into the lining of his coat. He would move it from coat to coat for the rest of his life, keeping it always next to his heart. It was found after his death. His family called it the memorial. The worldly period was over. Pascal withdrew from Parisian society. He stopped attending the salons. He told the Duc de Rohanne that he could no longer continue their former life. He began spending extended periods at Port-Royal, living among the monks and nuns, participating in their austere routines. His family was relieved. His sister Jacqueline was overjoyed. The brilliant mathematician had finally, fully committed himself to God. He would spend his remaining years in service to the faith. But Pascal didn't abandon his intellect. He redirected it. If mathematics could reveal patterns in dice throws, if physics could explain barometric pressure, if probability theory could make sense of uncertain futures, then surely that same rigorous thinking could be applied to questions of faith. He began working on what he called an apology for the Christian religion, a defense of Christianity written not for believers, but for skeptics, for the aristocratic friends he'd left behind in Paris, who lived comfortably without God and saw no reason to change, for the mathematicians and scientists who thought religion was superstition, for anyone who'd looked at the world's suffering and concluded that if God existed, he was either cruel or absent. This wouldn't be a systematic treatise. Pascal distrusted systems. They were too neat, too confident, too disconnected from how people actually thought and felt. Instead, it would be a series of fragments, observations, arguments, each one a different angle of approach to the central question. Why believe? He never finished it. His health, already fragile, continued to deteriorate. The headaches became unbearable. He could work only in brief sessions, scribbling notes on whatever paper was at hand, organising them into piles according to rough themes. When the pain was too great, he he would dictate to whoever was nearby. The fragments accumulated. Some were a single sentence, others ran for pages. Some were polished and ready for publication. Others were rough sketches, notes to himself about arguments he intended to develop further. There were contradictions, repetitions, gaps where clearly something was meant to go but never did. What emerged from these fragments, published after his death as the pensées, or thoughts, was unlike anything that had come before in Christian apologetics. It wasn't systematic theology, it wasn't philosophy in the traditional sense. It was something new, a psychological and existential analysis of the human condition, using every tool Pascal had developed in mathematics, physics, and probability theory, but applied to questions that transcended all of them. The central insight was simple and devastating. Human beings are caught between two infinities, the infinitely large and the infinitely small. We're not at home in the universe. We're suspended in the middle, unable to grasp either extreme, aware of our own insignificance and yet somehow capable of contemplating the vastness that dwarfs us. When I consider the brief span of my life absorbed into the eternity which comes before and after, Pascal wrote, the small space I occupy and which I see swallowed up in the infinite immensity of spaces of which I know nothing and which know nothing of me, I take fright and am amazed to see myself here rather than there. There is no reason for me to be here rather than there, now rather than then. This wasn't despair, it was honesty. The starting point for any genuine thinking about human existence had to acknowledge this fundamental strangeness. We're accidents of time and place, specks of consciousness in an incomprehensible cosmos. Any philosophy or religion that didn't begin here was lying. But Pascal didn't stop at cosmic insignificance. He moved to something even more disturbing, the human heart. Turn your attention inward, he suggested, and you find something equally paradoxical. We're capable of nobility and goodness, of mathematics and art and self-sacrifice. And we're simultaneously capable of pettiness, cruelty, self-deception. We're glorious and wretched in equal measure. This was the human condition, grandeur and misery intertwined, and no philosophy that emphasized only one side could explain us. The optimists who proclaimed human perfectibility were ignoring the evidence. The pessimists who saw only corruption were missing something essential. We contained both. Christianity, Pascal argued, was the only worldview that made sense of this paradox. Humans were created in God's image, which explained the grandeur, and humans had fallen, which explained the misery. The doctrine of original sin wasn't a piece of primitive mythology. It was the most accurate description of what we observe when we look at ourselves honestly. The fragments built slowly toward their conclusion, not through logical steps, but through accumulated weight, through observations that anyone could verify in their own experience. And at the center of it all was a claim that couldn't be proven mathematically, but that Pascal insisted was nevertheless true. God became human. The infinite entered the finite. The Creator suffered with his creation. This was the scandal at the heart of Christianity, the thing that made it different from every philosophical system. It wasn't a theory about the world, it was an event, something that happened, something that changed everything. And yet Pascal knew that even this wasn't enough. You couldn't argue someone into faith, not really. The fragments contained brilliant observations about human nature, devastating critiques of competing worldviews, but at a certain point, argument had to give way to something else. This was where probability theory returned, not as proof, but as a wager. The argument that became known as Pascal's wager appeared in fragments 233 and 234 of the Pensées. It's been misunderstood, oversimplified, and attacked for 3.5 centuries. But what Pascal actually wrote was far more subtle than most critics realize. He began with a premise that his skeptical readers would have to accept. We cannot know with certainty whether God exists. The question transcends the limits of human reason. We're forced to bet on an answer without having proof either way. God is or he is not, Pascal wrote, but to which view shall we be inclined? Reason cannot decide this question, so we're gambling whether we like it or not. Refusing to choose is itself a choice. You can't abstain from the wager because your life is the stake. Now apply probability theory. What are the outcomes? If you bet that God exists and you're right, you gain infinite happiness, eternal life, everything that matters. If you're wrong, you lose nothing significant. You've lived a moral life, found meaning and purpose, but when you die, there's simply nothing. The loss is finite. If you bet that God doesn't exist and you're right, you gain what? The freedom to pursue pleasures without guilt? The satisfaction of being correct? These are finite gains. If you're wrong, you lose everything. Infinite loss. The mathematics were clear. An infinite gain times any positive probability, no matter how small, outweighs any finite gain. And an infinite loss times any positive probability, no matter how small, outweighs any finite loss. Therefore, rational self-interest dictates betting on God's existence. Critics pounced immediately. This reduces faith to calculation. It's mercenary. It's cowardly. It doesn't prove anything about whether God actually exists. And what about all the other possible gods? How do you know which one to bet on? Pascal anticipated every objection. The wager wasn't meant to prove God exists. It was meant to show that believing is rational, even in the face of uncertainty. And the Christianity Pascal described wasn't about following rules to win a reward. It was about transformation, about becoming the kind of person capable of seeing what you couldn't see before. You want to find faith, and you do not know the road, Pascal wrote. Learn from those who were once bound like you, and who now wager all they have. Follow the way by which they began. They behaved just as if they did believe. This was startling advice. Act as if. Go through the motions. Attend Mass, pray, read Scripture. Not as pretense, but as practice. The transformation comes from the doing, not from achieving certainty first. It was the opposite of Descartes' method. Descartes wanted to doubt everything until he found something certain. Pascal suggested that certainty might come after commitment, not before. But the wager was only one fragment among hundreds. The real power of the pensée lay elsewhere, in observations about human nature that cut through every defense. Diversion. That was Pascal's term for what we do to avoid facing ourselves. We fill our lives with activity, noise, entertainment, not because these things satisfy us, but because they prevent us from sitting alone in a room with our own thoughts. I have discovered that all the unhappiness of men arises from one single fact, Pascal wrote, that they cannot stay quietly in their own room. Watch people closely, watch yourself. The moment we're left without distraction, we become restless. We reach for our phones, turn on music, call a friend, plan the next activity. Why? Because silence forces us to confront questions we'd rather avoid. Who am I? What am I for? Why am I here rather than not here? What happens when I die? Diversion isn't recreation, it's escape. We run from ourselves constantly, and we call it living. This observation hit readers with the force of recognition. Pascal wasn't describing a philosophical problem, he was describing Thursday afternoon. The feeling you get when you finish everything on your to-do list and suddenly don't know what to do with yourself. The panic that sets in when you're alone with nothing scheduled. We're addicted to distraction because facing our actual condition is unbearable. We're contingent beings in an indifferent universe, aware of our own mortality, capable of imagining perfection, but unable to achieve it. Of course, we prefer to stay busy, but Christianity offered something radical, not escape from the human condition, but a way through it. The incarnation meant that God entered into suffering, experienced finitude, died. The infinite became finite. which meant that the human predicament wasn't a mistake to be corrected, but something that could be redeemed from within. This wasn't philosophy in the abstract, it was lived experience, and Pascal's own experience of faith had come not through argument, but through encounter. On November 23rd, 1654, something happened. Pascal never described it publicly. He wrote a single document, now called the Memorial, and sewed it into the lining of his coat. It was discovered after his death, transferred from coat to coat over the years, apparently something he wanted close at all times, but never meant to share. The Memorial is strange. Disconnected phrases, biblical references, exclamations. It begins with fire, written in capital letters, then records the date and time. From about 10:30 in the evening until about midnight midnight. 2 hours. Something happened during those 2 hours that Pascal considered the most important event of his life. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, the Memorial reads, not of the philosophers and scholars, certainty, feeling, joy, peace, God of Jesus Christ. Then later, forgetfulness of the world and of everything except God. Joy, tears of joy. Whatever this was, it wasn't intellectual. It was direct, overwhelming, transformative, the kind of experience that can't be adequately described, only pointed to. The man who had spent years calculating trajectories and probabilities encountered something that transcended calculation. The Memorial ended with a commitment, total submission to Jesus Christ and to my director. Eternal joy for one day of exercise on earth. I will not forget thy word. Amen. Pascal never explained what happened that night. The Pensées contain only oblique references. The heart has its reasons, which reason does not know. And it is the heart which perceives God and not the reason. This wasn't anti-intellectualism. Pascal's entire life testified to the power of reason. But he recognized that reason had limits. There were truths accessible only through different faculties. The mathematician could not calculate his way to God. The physicist could not measure grace. Some knowledge came through other means. The Port Royal community, where Pascal spent increasing amounts of time, understood this. They emphasized the transformation of the heart, the reordering of loves. You couldn't think your way to holiness. You had to be changed from within. But Pascal's health was collapsing. The headaches that had plagued him since childhood grew worse. His digestive system failed. He could barely eat. Friends who visited found him pale, weak, aged beyond his years. He was in his late 30s, but looked like an old man. He continued working on the Pensées whenever strength permitted. Fragments accumulated, arguments took shape. But the project would never be finished, not in the systematic way he'd planned. In 1659, Pascal's doctors recommended a cure, travel, fresh air, change of scene. Against his better judgment, he agreed to visit his sister, Gilberte, in Clermont. The journey was agony. Every jolt of the carriage sent pain through his body. But something happened in Clermont, not a physical healing, but a return of mental clarity. He worked on problems in geometry, corresponded with mathematicians, even published a small treatise on the cycloid. It was a final burst of intellectual energy before the end. Back in Paris by 1660, Pascal threw himself into one last practical project: public transportation. Paris had no system for moving ordinary people around the city. The wealthy had carriages, everyone else walked. Pascal proposed a network of horse-drawn coaches that would follow fixed routes for a modest fare. It was typical Pascal, a mathematical problem in disguise. How to optimize routes, how to set prices that would be affordable but sustainable, how to schedule departures to minimize wait times. He worked out the details with the same precision he'd applied to vacuums and probability. The system launched in 1662 with 5 routes. It was immediately popular. The first public transit system in history, conceived by a dying mathematician during his final months. But the effort cost him. By spring of 1662, Pascal was bedridden. The headaches were constant. He couldn't keep food down. His mind remained sharp, but the body was failing rapidly. Friends gathered. His sister, Gilberte, came to Paris. Doctors attempted treatments that only added to his suffering. Pascal accepted it all with a remarkable calm. The man who had once been terrified of death now faced it directly. On August 17th, 1662, Pascal asked to receive communion. The priest came. Pascal received the sacrament with tears streaming down his face. Hours later, he went into convulsions. By morning, he was gone. He was 39 years old. The funeral was held at Saint-Étienne-du-Mont, the church where he'd attended Mass. The crowd was large. Pascal had been famous. The mathematician who proved vacuums could exist. The author of the provincial letters that had shaken the Catholic establishment. The inventor of the calculator and the omnibus. A brilliant, troubled, holy man who had lived more intensely in 39 years than most people manage in twice that span. His papers were gathered, sorted, examined. The Pensée fragments were organised and published 8 years after his death. They were incomplete, unpolished, sometimes contradictory. They were also immediately recognised as a masterpiece. The book went through edition after edition. Philosophers studied it. Theologians preached from it. Skeptics argued against it. The fragments that Pascal had intended as preparation for a great systematic work became more influential than any systematic work could have been. Precisely because they were fragmentary, they invited engagement. Each reader had to complete the arguments in their own mind. 3.5 centuries later, the Pensée remains in print in dozens of languages. The wager is still debated in philosophy classrooms. The observations about human nature still feel contemporary. Pascal speaks across the centuries, not because he had all the answers, but because he asked the right questions. What is a human being? A thinking reed, Pascal said, crushed by the universe physically, but capable of knowing that we're being crushed. Weaker than the forces that destroy us, but greater than them because we comprehend our own destruction, and the universe comprehends nothing. The universe doesn't know it's vast. We know we're small, and that knowledge, that capacity for self-awareness, is our dignity and our tragedy. We're caught between two infinities, between grandeur and misery, between the mathematical precision that orders the cosmos and the chaotic desires that disorder our hearts. We're contradictions, and Christianity, Pascal insisted, was the only story that explained the contradiction without explaining it away. But Pascal's influence extended beyond religious apologetics. His mathematical work continued to shape science. The probability theory he'd developed with Fermat became the foundation for statistics, risk analysis, actuarial science. Insurance companies use his methods. Financial markets run on his mathematics. Medical trials employ his insights about chance and certainty. Every time you calculate odds, or assess risk, or try to make a decision under uncertainty, you're using tools Pascal helped forge. The calculator he invented wasn't commercially successful during his lifetime, but the principle survived. Leibniz built on Pascal's work. So did countless others. The direct line runs from Pascal's arithmetic machine through Babbage's difference engine to the computer you're using right now. Every digital device owes something to the man who first mechanized calculation. The pneumatic experiments influenced the development of steam engines. The vacuum tubes Pascal had studied became the foundation for atmospheric pressure engines. The Newcomen engine, the Watt engine, the Industrial Revolution itself, all built on discoveries about air pressure that Pascal had helped establish. His work on fluids became the basis for hydraulics. Modern brakes, lifts, and countless industrial systems operate on Pascal's principle. The unit of pressure bears his name. Every weather report mentioning barometric pressure, every diving manual explaining decompression, every engineering calculation involving force distribution uses concepts Pascal clarified. His theological writings shaped Catholic intellectual life for centuries. The Jansenist movement he'd defended was eventually suppressed by papal decree in 1713. But the questions Pascal raised about grace, free will, and the relationship between reason and faith continued to resonate. Philosophers of every stripe engaged with his arguments. Voltaire attacked him. Chateaubriand defended him. Kierkegaard found in Pascal a kindred spirit wrestling with the terror and attraction of faith. Dostoevsky read him obsessively. The 20th century brought renewed interest. Existentialists saw Pascal as a precursor. Here was a thinker who understood anxiety, who'd stared into the abyss and reported back. Camus wrote about Pascal's wager, ultimately rejecting it but treating it seriously. Sartre engaged with Pascal's anthropology, the vision of humanity as fundamentally contradictory. Even secular philosophers acknowledged Pascal's genius for psychological observation. His descriptions of human nature, the way we distract ourselves from existential dread, the mechanisms we use to avoid thinking about death, these insights didn't require belief to recognize their accuracy. The wager itself became one of the most discussed arguments in philosophy. Critics pointed out apparent flaws. What if you're wagering on the wrong God? What if God punishes calculated belief? What if you can't simply choose to believe? Pascal had anticipated some objections. Others were genuinely problematic. But the wager's influence didn't depend on being logically airtight. It shifted the conversation. It treated religious commitment as a decision made under uncertainty, rather than a conclusion reached through proof. This was new. Before Pascal, theology either claimed certainty through revelation or tried to demonstrate God's existence through natural reason. Pascal said neither approach worked. Revelation is circular if you don't already believe. Natural theology produces at best a philosopher's God, not the God of Abraham. What remains is the choice, and for Pascal, refusing to choose was itself a choice. The person who says, "I'll wait for more evidence," is betting against God just as surely as the atheist. There's no neutral ground. Every day you live as if God doesn't exist or as if God does exist. The wager forces recognition of this reality. We're already gambling whether we acknowledge it or not. Modern decision theory has complicated Pascal's mathematics. We understand now that you can't simply multiply infinite utility by any positive probability and get a meaningful answer. The calculation breaks down. But decision theorists still reference the wager because Pascal saw something important. Under conditions of uncertainty with asymmetric outcomes, expected value calculations can justify seemingly irrational commitments. The structure of his argument, if not every detail, survives scrutiny. His influence on probability theory was immediate and lasting. The correspondence with Fermat established the field. Within a generation, mathematicians across Europe were developing the calculus of chances. Jacob Bernoulli built on their work. Abraham de Moivre extended it. Thomas Bayes revolutionized it. Each acknowledged debts to Pascal. The questions they explored about fairness in games of chance, about expectation and risk, about how to reason under uncertainty. These were questions Pascal and Fermat had first formulated precisely. By the 18th century, probability was being applied to law, insurance, demography. By the 19th, it was central to physics and biology. By the 20th, it was everywhere. Quantum mechanics described reality probabilistically. Genetics became a science of statistical distributions. Economics embraced stochastic models. Information theory, game theory, machine learning all rest on mathematical foundations Pascal helped establish during that summer of 1654, when he and Fermat exchanged letters about dice. The calculator's legacy took longer to manifest but proved equally significant. Pascal's machine demonstrated that arithmetic could be mechanized. This wasn't obvious in 1642. Calculation seemed inherently mental, something only consciousness could perform. Pascal showed otherwise. Gears and wheels could add and subtract. The implications were profound. If arithmetic could be mechanized, what else could? Leibniz wondered if logic itself might be reduced to calculation. Babbage dreamed of engines that could compute anything. Turing proved that any computable function could be executed by a sufficiently simple machine. The chain of reasoning leads directly from Pascal's calculator to modern computing. His theological vision proved harder to categorize. Pascal wasn't trying to create a new Christian denomination. He remained Catholic despite defending Jansenist positions the Church condemned. He wasn't trying to reform theology into something more rational. He thought rationalism in religion was the problem. He wasn't mystical in the traditional sense. His visions were rare, and he treated them with suspicion. What was he doing? Perhaps Pascal was trying to preserve Christianity for people who couldn't ignore what reason revealed about the world. He'd seen what science could do. He'd helped expand human knowledge into realms that had been mysteries. He couldn't pretend that revelation answered questions that mathematics could answer better. But he also couldn't accept that science exhausted reality. The heart had reasons that reason didn't recognize. This wasn't anti-intellectualism. It was an attempt to delineate two domains. Reason was supreme in its sphere, and its sphere was vast, but it wasn't everything. The human person wasn't merely a thinking machine. We have desires, longings, fears that mathematics can't capture. We seek meaning, purpose, love. We're disturbed by our own mortality and the suffering we witness. We want justice in a universe that seems indifferent to it. These aren't irrational concerns. They're concerns that reason alone doesn't address. Religion, Pascal thought, spoke to this dimension of human existence, not by providing proofs, but by offering a story that made sense of the contradiction. We're both miserable and great, fallen but redeemable, finite but aware of infinity. Christianity explained this paradox. Original sin explained the misery. The incarnation explained the grandeur. Christ's suffering made sense of human suffering. The resurrection offered hope beyond death. It was a story that fit the human condition as Pascal experienced it. Whether it was true in the way mathematical theorems are true was the wrong question. It was true in the way stories are true when they illuminate something about existence that facts alone can't capture. Critics found this unsatisfying then and now. Either Christianity's historical claims are true or they're not. Either Jesus rose from the dead or he didn't. Pascal seemed to be evading the question by changing what truth means. But Pascal wasn't evading. He was distinguishing. Historical truth matters. He believed Jesus rose, but that belief wasn't reached through historical investigation. It was reached through the combined witness of reason showing its own limits, of the heart sensing its own need, and of grace enabling faith. This threefold structure, reason, heart, grace, was Pascal's synthesis. Reason clears away false proofs and shows the universe is larger and stranger than we imagined. The heart, confronting this vastness and its own smallness, seeks something beyond itself. Grace, if it comes, enables the leap that reason can't make and the heart can't force. Faith isn't irrational, it's transrational. It operates in a dimension where calculation doesn't reach. Pascal's influence on later religious thought was enormous, but often unacknowledged. Many thinkers who rejected his specific arguments absorbed his general approach. The 19th century emphasis on religious experience over doctrine owed something to Pascal's prioritization of the heart. The 20th century theology that emphasized God's hiddenness, the absence as much as the presence, echoed Pascal's insistence that God wouldn't be obvious. Even the contemporary apologetics that focus on existential need rather than logical proof follow paths Pascal mapped. When someone argues that life without God is meaningless, when someone points to the human longing for transcendence as evidence of transcendence's reality, when someone suggests that atheism requires more faith than belief, they're using Pascalian strategies. He didn't invent these arguments, but he gave them their most powerful expression. His writing style influenced French literature. The provincial letters established a new prose standard. Lucid, witty, devastating, they showed how philosophical and theological arguments could be presented with literary artistry. Voltaire learned from Pascal even while attacking his conclusions. The French Enlightenment's characteristic clarity, the ability to make complex ideas accessible without dumbing them down, owed much to Pascal's example. The Pensées influenced differently. Their fragmentary nature, the way they circled around themes without exhausting them, the aphoristic brilliance that invited interpretation, this became a model for a certain kind of philosophical writing. Nietzsche's aphorisms, Wittgenstein's numbered propositions, Cioran's short pessimistic meditations, all are here something to Pascal's fragments. The specific content of Pascal's thought mattered less over time than the posture he embodied. He represented a way of being intellectual that wasn't purely academic. He engaged the world practically through inventions and public transportation while maintaining contemplative depth. He mastered mathematics while insisting on its limitations. He defended tradition while thinking radically. He was simultaneously inside and outside the establishment. This combination of traits made him a model for later thinkers who resisted easy categorization. You couldn't dismiss him as an ivory tower theorist. He'd solved practical problems and started businesses. You couldn't dismiss him as anti-intellectual. He'd advanced multiple sciences and invented new mathematical methods. He stood as proof that scientific brilliance and religious faith weren't incompatible. In an era increasingly characterized by warfare between science and religion, Pascal offered an alternative, not because he harmonized them into a comfortable synthesis, but because he lived the tension without resolving it. He let reason and faith occupy their separate domains while acknowledging the permanent discomfort of inhabiting both. This refusal of easy resolution, this willingness to live with paradox, was perhaps his most important legacy. He didn't solve the problem of how to be both rational and faithful. He demonstrated that the problem might not need solving, that the tension itself might be where truth lives. The memorial he'd sewn into his coat, the record of his night of fire, was found after his death and preserved. 8 years of his life, he'd carried it next to his heart. Fire, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and scholars. Certitude, certitude, feeling, joy, peace. The words were disjointed, ecstatic, the record of an experience that language couldn't fully capture. Yet he'd tried to capture it. He'd written it down. He'd kept it with him as a reminder of what? That rational proof wasn't everything. That the God he believed in wasn't a conclusion, but an encounter. That certainty came not from argument, but from something else entirely. All of these, perhaps. The memorial was Pascal's answer to anyone who thought his apologetics were merely clever rhetoric, he believed. Not because the wager was logically compelling, though he thought it was. Not because Christianity explained human nature well, though he thought it did. He believed because something had happened to him, something he could only describe as fire. And that experience, incommunicable and subjective, was the foundation. Everything else, the arguments, the observations, the mathematical analogies, was scaffolding built after the fact. Attempts to articulate and defend what he encountered during those hours when the philosopher's God disappeared and another God revealed himself. The question that haunted Pascal's final years wasn't whether Christianity was true. He'd settled that for himself. The question was how to live knowing what he knew. how to reconcile the burning certainty of that November night with the daily reality of a body breaking down, a world indifferent to revelation, a church sometimes more concerned with politics than truth. He was dying. He knew it. The headaches that had plagued him since 18 grew worse. His stomach could tolerate almost nothing. Sleep came in fragments. Yet he continued working, not on the apology anymore. That project had slipped away from him. Instead, he focused on something smaller, more immediate, helping the poor of Paris. In 1662, the year of his death, Pascal organized a public transportation system for the city. 5 routes with regular schedules and fixed fares. Carriages that anyone could board regardless of social standing. It was a radical idea. Transportation had always been for those who could afford private coaches or sedan chairs. The common people walked. Pascal designed a system where a craftsman and a nobleman might share a bench, where mobility wasn't determined by birth. The project succeeded. The routes operated profitably. Other cities copied the model. It seems a strange final act for a man who'd spent his last years contemplating eternity. But Pascal saw no contradiction. Helping people navigate Paris and helping them navigate existence were both expressions of the same impulse. You serve dear God by serving others. Practically, concretely. Not just through prayer or theological argument. His family grew concerned about his asceticism. He gave away his possessions. He invited a poor family to live in his house. When his sister protested that he was making himself ill through excessive charity, he replied that he had no right to superfluities, while others lacked necessities. The logic was clear. He'd calculated the odds. He'd chosen his wager. Now he was living it, not tentatively, not with reservation, all the way. August 17th arrived hot and oppressive. Pascal could no longer leave his bed. His mind remained clear, but his body was failing systematically. The doctors could do nothing. Medicine in 1662 consisted mostly of bloodletting and guesswork. They tried both. Neither helped. He asked for communion. The priest came. Pascal took the sacrament with tears streaming down his face. Those present recorded that his expression was one of joy, not fear. He lingered through the night. At one point he said, "May God never abandon me." These were his final words. Simple, devoid of the brilliance that had characterized his writing. Just a prayer, just a hope. He died shortly after midnight, on August 19th. He was 39 years old. The autopsy revealed extensive damage throughout his body. Stomach lesions, intestinal ulcers, brain abnormalities that might explain the headaches. His organs, the doctors noted, looked like those of a man far older. Pain had been his constant companion since adolescence. He'd lived his entire adult life in physical agony. This context changes how we read him. The skepticism about human nature, the insistence on wretchedness, the focus on suffering and redemption. These weren't abstract philosophical positions. They were observations from inside a body that hurt. When Pascal wrote that man is wretched, he knew what wretchedness felt like. When he wrote about the need for something beyond human capacity to save us, he was speaking from experience. His own capacity had been insufficient. Dasein couldn't cure him. Philosophy couldn't comfort him. Only faith offered anything that helped. Yet he never used his suffering as proof of God's existence or absence. He didn't argue that his pain demonstrated divine punishment or testing. He simply noted that pain exists, that it's fundamental to human experience, and that any worldview ignoring this fact is inadequate. Christianity, in his view, took suffering seriously. It didn't explain it away or pretend it wasn't real. It placed suffering at the center of its story. God himself suffers. This resonated with Pascal in ways that philosophical systems built on pure reason never could. The Pensées were published posthumously in 1670. The editors struggled with how to organize the fragments. Pascal had left notes about structure, but nothing definitive. They did their best, grouping related passages, imposing an order Pascal might not have chosen. The result was imperfect, but powerful. Readers encountered a brilliant mind wrestling with ultimate questions, not providing neat answers, but showing the wrestling itself. The book became controversial immediately. The Jesuits, still smarting from the provincial letters, attacked it. Voltaire mocked it. The Enlightenment thinkers who followed found Pascal's pessimism about human nature offensive. How dare he suggest reason was limited? How dare he claim we needed grace? The whole point of the Enlightenment was liberating humanity from such superstitious dependence. But the book survived its critics. Generation after generation discovered it. Each found something different. The Romantics loved the emphasis on feeling and intuition. The existentialists appreciated the confrontation with absurdity and the necessity of choice. The postmodernists admired the fragmentary form and the resistance to systematic closure. Pascal kept speaking because he'd articulated something permanent. The human condition doesn't change. We're still caught between knowing too much and too little, still aware of our mortality but unable to accept it, still seeking meaning in a universe that doesn't obviously provide it, still trying to decide what to believe and how to live. The specific religious framework Pascal proposed might not persuade everyone, but the questions he asked remain inescapable. His influence on French literature was immediate and enduring. Racine, the great tragedian, was deeply influenced by Pascal's Jansenist pessimism. The dark psychology of Racine's characters, their inability to escape their own destructive passions, reflects Pascal's vision of human nature. Rousseau, though he rejected Pascal's conclusions, was shaped by his questions. The tension in Rousseau's work between natural goodness and social corruption echoes Pascal's wrestling with human duality. Even Voltaire, Pascal's most vocal critic, was influenced by what he opposed. His optimistic deism was partly a reaction against Pascal's stark presentation of the human predicament. The scientific legacy was more complicated. Pascal's mathematical work was absorbed into the growing body of mathematical knowledge. His contributions to probability theory, to projective geometry, to the study of fluids, these became part of the standard curriculum, but they were detached from their author's broader concerns. Scientists studied Pascal's triangle without thinking about Pascal's wager. Engineers used Pascal's principle without reading the Pensée. The unity Pascal had sought between scientific and spiritual inquiry was broken. Science went one direction, theology went another. Philosophy tried to mediate, but mostly split the difference. The modern world emerged from this fragmentation, specialized disciplines that didn't talk to each other, experts in narrow domains who know why nothing outside their field. The kind of comprehensive thinking Pascal represented became rare, then nearly extinct. Yet every so often someone appears who thinks across boundaries, who refuses to choose between reason and intuition, between science and meaning, between analysis and wonder. These people often cite Pascal as an inspiration, not because they agree with his specific beliefs, but because he modeled a way of being intellectual that wasn't reductive, that didn't pretend complexity was simple, or that mystery could be eliminated through sufficient study. Pascal's relevance today might be greater than ever. We live in an age of information overload and existential confusion. We have access to more knowledge than any previous generation, but seem less certain about what matters. We can calculate and measure and analyze everything, but struggle with basic questions about purpose and value. The tools Pascal critiqued, pure reason and empirical observation, have become more powerful than he could have imagined, and they've proven exactly as limited as he predicted. We can sequence the human genome, but can't decide what makes life worth living. We can split atoms, but can't agree on how to treat each other. We can cure diseases Pascal couldn't have conceived of, but haven't cured the human heart's tendency toward cruelty and self-deception. His wager feels particularly relevant in an age of uncertainty. We're all gambling whether we acknowledge it or not, gambling that our choices matter or don't, that consciousness continues after death or doesn't, that there's meaning to discover or only meaning to invent, that our actions have consequences beyond the immediately visible, or that nothing we do ultimately matters. You can't not choose. Even refusing to think about it is a choice. Even saying you'll wait for more evidence is a choice. You're living right now according to some set of assumptions about reality, whether you've examined those assumptions or not. Pascal simply made the choice explicit and thought through its logic, but the wager shouldn't be separated from everything else Pascal wrote. It wasn't meant as a standalone argument. It was one piece of a larger vision. The vision said human beings are paradoxical creatures, capable of greatness and pettiness, reason and madness, nobility and wretchedness, that we're lost without admitting we're lost, that our natural condition is one of confusion and distraction, that we fill our lives with diversions to avoid confronting the reality of our situation, and that Christianity, whatever else it is, takes all this seriously, offers a diagnosis that matches the symptoms. Whether that diagnosis is correct is something each person decides for themselves. Pascal knew he couldn't prove it. He could only point toward it, describe what he'd experienced, clear away some of the intellectual obstacles, and hope his readers would encounter what he'd encountered. That night of fire, that certainty, that joy. He'd spent 8 years carrying the record of that experience next to his heart, not as proof for others, but as a reminder for himself. Because certainty fades, the memory of ecstasy dims. Daily life with its demands and disappointments crowds out transcendent moments. He needed to remember that it had happened, that for a few hours the world had made sense in a way it never had before or since, that he'd touched something real. The memorial was found after his death, sewn into the lining of his coat, exactly where he'd kept it. His family had it copied and preserved. It exists today in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, a fragile piece of paper covered in Pascal's hurried handwriting. Scholars debate what some of the words mean. The syntax is broken, the thoughts incomplete, but the intensity is unmistakable. This was not a man making an intellectual argument. This was a man recording an experience that overwhelmed his capacity to articulate it. Fire. Not the fire of reason, which is cold and calculating. Not the fire of passion, which burns out. Something else, something that required a different vocabulary than philosophy provided. Pascal believed he'd encountered the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. Not the God of the philosophers, the abstract first cause or unmoved mover or ground of being. Those were ideas, useful for certain purposes, but not what he'd met that night. He'd met someone, not something, and that encounter changed everything. Made the arguments secondary, made the apologetics feel like explanations offered after the fact. The real foundation was what couldn't be communicated. The certitude that came not from reasoning, but from something else entirely. He called it the heart. Others might call it intuition, or religious experience, or mystical encounter. The name matters less than the recognition that it exists, that there are forms of knowing that don't proceed through logic, that certainty isn't always the conclusion of an argument. This is what makes Pascal difficult for modern readers. We've been trained to trust only what can be proven or demonstrated, to suspect claims based on subjective experience, to demand evidence, replicable results, peer review. Pascal understood that impulse. He was a scientist. He valued proof. He'd spent years calculating, measuring, experimenting, but he also knew that some of the most important things in life come to us differently. Love isn't proven. Beauty isn't demonstrated. Meaning isn't calculated. These things are known through different faculties, and faith, for Pascal, belonged in this category. Not faith as blind acceptance, but faith as a response to something encountered. Something that reason could prepare for, could clear obstacles toward, but couldn't produce. The question then becomes what to do with this claim. Pascal's contemporaries faced it directly. His readers today face it just as urgently. Either something happened that night, or it didn't. Either religious experience points towards something real, or it's a category error, mistaking psychological states for metaphysical truths. Pascal couldn't prove which interpretation was correct, but he could examine what difference it made. And here's where his thinking becomes genuinely unsettling, because he suggests that the refusal to take religious claims seriously might itself be a kind of willful blindness. Not intellectual honesty, but something closer to fear. Consider how we approach other domains of life. In mathematics, we trust that our reasoning faculties can grasp real truths about abstract objects. In science, we trust that careful observation reveals genuine patterns in nature. In ethics, most of us believe that moral claims are more than mere preferences, that cruelty really is wrong in some objective sense. Each of these involves a leap beyond pure empirical verification. Yet we make these leaps constantly, because the alternative is paralysis or incoherence. Religious faith, Pascal argued, requires a similar leap, not blind or irrational, but beyond what can be demonstrated with mathematical certainty. The question is whether we're willing to make it, whether we'll engage seriously with the possibility or dismiss it before considering the evidence. And by evidence, Pascal didn't mean logical proofs. He meant the accumulated testimony of people across centuries who claimed to have encountered something real. The saints and mystics, and ordinary believers whose lives were transformed by experiences they couldn't adequately explain. This is why Pascal grew frustrated with purely intellectual approaches to faith. They missed the point entirely. Debating the cosmological argument or the problem of evil was like arguing about whether someone could fall in love. The question isn't whether it's logically possible, but whether it happens. And for those who've experienced it, the reality is self-evident. The task isn't to prove it, but to describe it accurately enough that others might recognize it if they encounter it themselves. The provincial letters showed Pascal was capable of devastating intellectual combat when necessary. He could argue, refute, demolish opponents with surgical precision. But that wasn't what his apology was meant to do. It was meant to invite, to create space, to remove obstacles, to suggest that the materialist picture of reality might be incomplete, not because it's logically incoherent, but because it leaves out the most important dimension of human experience. His health continued its relentless decline through 1661. The headaches intensified. His digestive system, never robust, failed more completely. He could barely eat solid food. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by pain. His sister, Gilberte, watched helplessly as her brilliant brother's body betrayed him month by month. Yet his mind remained sharp, terrifyingly sharp given his physical state. He continued working on the apology when he could, though the sessions grew shorter and less frequent. The notes accumulated slowly now. Some days he managed only a few lines, other days nothing at all. His doctors tried everything available to 17th century medicine: bloodletting, purgatives, special diets, herbal remedies. Nothing helped. If anything, the treatments probably made things worse, weakening a body that had little strength left to lose. But medicine understood almost nothing about the conditions afflicting Pascal. They had no framework for diagnosing stomach cancer or brain tumours or whatever combination of ailments was destroying him. They could only watch and try remedies that had worked for other patients with vaguely similar symptoms. Pascal knew he was dying, not in the vague sense that we all are, but concretely, soon, unavoidably. The question was what to do with whatever time remained. He could have spent it preparing for death in the traditional sense, Confession, communion, settling his affairs, saying goodbye. He did some of that. But mostly he kept working, kept thinking, kept trying to articulate what he'd learned and experienced. The apology remained unfinished, but the fragments contained enough to show where he was heading. Toward a vision of Christianity that emphasized not doctrinal correctness, but lived experience, not rational proof, but encounter, not theology as a system, but faith as a response to something real that couldn't be fully captured in words. This made him suspect to both sides. The intellectuals thought he'd abandoned reason for mysticism. The devout thought he didn't emphasize doctrine strongly enough. He fit comfortably nowhere. Perhaps that was inevitable. Genuine religious experience tends to resist categorization. It doesn't align neatly with either rationalist or fideist positions. It insists on both the legitimacy of reason and its limits, on both the reality of what can't be proven and the need to think clearly about it. The Jansenists claimed him as one of their own, and in many ways he was. He believed in the corruption of human nature, the necessity of grace, the danger of presumption. But his thinking extended beyond the controversies that consumed Port Royal. He was after something bigger than the correct interpretation of Augustine. He was trying to articulate what it meant to be human in a universe that science was revealing to be far stranger and vaster than anyone had imagined. Because that was the real crisis of his era, not whether Jansenism or Molinism was correct, but whether meaning itself could survive the new cosmology, whether human beings mattered in a universe of infinite spaces, whether morality was anything more than useful fiction, whether hope was justified or merely a psychological defense against despair. Pascal's answer was yes, but not because he could prove it logically, because he'd experienced something that gave him certainty even when the arguments fell short. That night of fire was the foundation everything else was built on. Without it, he might have remained a brilliant mathematician and physicist. With it, he became something else, a witness to a reality that existed beyond what reason could demonstrate or science measure. This is what makes him relevant centuries later, not his specific theological positions, many of which feel dated or tied to controversies that no longer matter, but his insistence that there are forms of knowledge that don't come through the usual channels, that the human heart has reasons that reason doesn't recognize. That certainty about the most important things might come from sources that can't be verified by the methods we use to verify other claims. You can reject this, many do, but you can't dismiss it as simple irrationality or wishful thinking. Pascal was too intelligent, too disciplined, too committed to rigorous thought to be accused of intellectual laziness. If he claimed to have experienced something real that night in 1654, the claim deserves serious consideration, even from those who don't share his conclusions. The alternative is to say that all religious experience is delusion, that every mystic, every saint, every ordinary believer who reports encountering something transcendent is simply mistaken, that these experiences, however transformative they feel, point to nothing beyond brain chemistry and cultural conditioning. You can maintain that position consistently, but you should recognize what it commits you to, a universe in which consciousness somehow emerged from unconscious matter, developed the capacity to reason about itself, created mathematics and music and moral systems, yet remains fundamentally alone, where meaning is something we create rather than discover, where hope is a useful lie we tell ourselves to get through the day. Pascal thought he'd found evidence against that bleak picture. Not logical proof, but existential proof, the kind that comes from living through something that changes your fundamental orientation toward reality. He spent the last 8 years of his life trying to describe that experience and its implications, trying to create a path others might follow toward their own encounters. Not to convince through argument, but to point towards something that could only be known directly. His body failed before he could complete the project, but the fragments that survived contain enough to show what he was attempting. A philosophy that took both reason and revelation seriously. That acknowledged the power of logic while insisting on its limits. That demanded intellectual rigor while remaining open to forms of knowledge that didn't fit neatly into rational categories. This is why reading Pascal feels different from reading other philosophers. Descartes builds a system, Leibniz constructs elaborate architectures of thought. Spinoza proceeds geometrically from axioms to conclusions. Pascal does none of that. He circles around his subject, approaching it from different angles, offering insights rather than proofs, asking questions rather than delivering answers. The Pensées read less like philosophy and more like the notes of someone who encountered something extraordinary and is trying desperately to find words adequate to the experience. Which brings us back to that piece of paper sewn into his coat. The memorial. The record of the night that changed everything. He could have left it in a drawer or destroyed it entirely. Instead, he kept it close, literally next to his heart. A physical reminder of something that happened when the physical world seemed to fall away and reveal something else beneath. Was he right? Did he encounter God that night, or experience a particularly vivid psychological state? The question can't be answered by examining the evidence he left behind. Each person has to decide based on their own experiences and intuitions, based on whether the universe Pascal describes, one that includes both matter and meaning, both physics and transcendence, feels more true than the alternatives. What's undeniable is the transformation itself, the trajectory from brilliant scientist to tormented mystic, from comfortable intellectual to religious radical, from man of the world to man seeking something beyond the world. That change was real, regardless of what caused it, and its effects rippled outward in ways that are still felt today. In how we think about faith and reason, about certainty and doubt, about what it means to know something in the deepest sense. The Port Royal community watched Pascal's decline with a mixture of admiration and concern. He'd become their most effective defender, their sharpest mind, their connection to the intellectual world beyond their walls. But he was also increasingly difficult. His perfectionism made collaboration challenging. His intensity exhausted those around him. His mystical experiences set him apart even from other believers. They tried to care for him as his health collapsed. But Pascal was never an easy patient. He resisted treatments, questioned the doctors, pushed himself beyond what his body could sustain. He seemed to view his illness as something to be endured rather than fought, perhaps even as something meaningful, a sharing in the suffering he believed was central to Christian life. Not punishment, but participation. Not curse, but gift, however painful. This attitude baffled his physicians and frustrated his family. Why wouldn't he rest properly? Why did he insist on continuing to work when work was clearly killing him? The answer lay in whatever he'd experienced that November night. It had given him a certainty that death wasn't the end, that his suffering had purpose, that the brief remaining time was precious not for its own sake, but for what he might accomplish before it ran out. His sister Gilberte would later write about these final years with a mixture of grief and awe, grief at watching someone she loved suffer so terribly, awe at his spiritual transformation. The brilliant young man she'd grown up with had become something she barely recognized, still her brother but also something more or different, someone touched by certainty she couldn't fully understand. The question of what to do with Pascal's unfinished writings became urgent as his condition worsened through 1661 and into 1662. He'd been working on something massive, something he called his apology for the Christian religion. Hundreds of pages of notes, arguments sketched out, fragments of brilliance scattered across countless sheets of paper. None of it organized, none of it complete. Some pieces were fully developed passages ready for publication. Others were single sentences, cryptic reminders of ideas he'd planned to expand later. Still others were contradictory, multiple approaches to the same problem that he hadn't yet decided between. The Port Royal community recognized the value of what Pascal had produced, but they also saw the chaos, and they knew that Pascal himself, the only person who truly understood the architecture of the whole project, was dying. Attempts to get him to organize the material himself failed. He was too weak, too distracted by pain, too focused on what he considered more immediate spiritual concerns. So his friends did what they could. They gathered the papers, tried to impose some kind of order, began the work of turning fragments into something publishable. But they were working without a map. Pascal had kept the grand design in his head. Now that head was failing and the design was disappearing with it. What we know as the pensée, the thoughts, is the result of that desperate salvage operation. Not the book Pascal intended to write, but the pieces of it that survived. Scholars have spent centuries trying to reconstruct his original plan, rearranging the fragments like a puzzle with no picture on the box. Some arrangements seem more convincing than others. None can claim to be definitive. This is why the pensée feels so different from traditional philosophy texts. They're not systematic. They don't build arguments step by careful step. They circle around ideas, approach them from multiple angles, contradict themselves, leave thoughts unfinished. Because that's what they are. The workshop of a genius, not the finished product. Yet there's something appropriate about this. Pascal's thought was always restless, always questioning, always refusing to settle into comfortable certainty. The fragmentary nature of the pensée captures that restlessness better than any polished treatise could have. You read them and you're not re-iving doctrine. You're watching someone think, struggling with problems that have no easy answers, changing his mind, starting over, trying again. It's philosophy as process rather than conclusion. He confessed his sins, received communion, prepared himself for what he believed was coming next. He also gave away what little money he had. His lottery system had made him some wealth, but he'd already donated most of it. Now he distributed the rest, to the poor, to religious communities, to anyone he felt had a claim. He wanted to die with empty hands. His family gathered, his sisters Gilberte and Jacqueline, though Jacqueline herself was gravely ill. His brother-in-law, Florent Perrier, who'd performed the barometer experiment years ago. Various Port Royal friends and priests. They kept vigil as Pascal's condition deteriorated through the summer of 1662. In June, he suffered what appears to have been a stroke. Paralysis spread through his body. Speech became difficult, but his mind remained clear until nearly the end. He could still communicate, still express his thoughts, still pray. On August 17th, he requested final communion. The priest brought the sacrament and Pascal received it with what witnesses described as profound joy. His last clear words were expressions of faith and hope. Then came the final decline. On August 19th, 1662, at 1 o'clock in the morning, Blaise Pascal died. He was 39 years old. They buried him in the church of Saint-Étienne-de-Mont in Paris, not far from where he'd lived. A modest funeral for someone who'd rejected worldly glory. His tomb bears a simple inscription, Latin phrases about his virtues and accomplishments, nothing about the night of fire, nothing about the memorial he'd kept sewn in his coat. That remained private, discovered only when his servants were preparing his clothes for storage. They found the hidden parchment and brought it to his family. Gilberte recognized its importance immediately. She had copies made, preserved the original, ensured it wouldn't be lost. She understood that whatever had happened to her brother that November night was the key to understanding everything that followed. The transformation from mathematician to mystic, the fierce defense of Jansenism, the unfinished apology, the willingness to suffer. All of it traced back to that moment when Pascal encountered what he believed was God himself. Now he was gone, and the memorial was all that remained of the experience. 8 years of trying to explain it, defend it, build upon it. 8 years of fragmentary brilliance. 8 years of a genius burning himself out in service of something he could never fully communicate. Port Royal mourned him as their champion. The Jesuits probably breathed a sigh of relief. The intellectual world noted the passing of someone who had once promised to be among the greatest minds of the age, but none of them fully grasped what Pascal had been attempting, how he'd been trying to bridge two worlds that most people assumed were forever separate: the world of reason and the world of faith, of mathematics and mysticism, of provable truth and transcendent experience. His death seemed to prove the impossibility of the project. You can't live in both worlds at once. The tension tears you apart. Pascal had tried, and it killed him, or so it seemed to those who watched him die. What they couldn't see was the longer arc, how his fragments would survive, how future generations would find in them something that spoke to their own struggles with belief and doubt, how the Pensées would become one of the most widely read works in free NCH literature, how the wager would become a standard part of philosophy curricula, how Pascal's name would be attached to programming languages and units of pressure, how the intensity of his brief life would cast a shadow far longer than anyone standing at his grave could have imagined. The publication of the Pensées came in 1670, 8 years after Pascal's death. His Port Royal friends assembled what they could from the chaos of papers. They organised the fragments under broad themes. They edited out some of the more controversial passages, worried about antagonising the church authorities. They presented it as a work in progress, not a finished book. The response was immediate and polarised. Some readers found it profound, a window into a brilliant mind wrestling with ultimate question. Others found it frustrating, too fragmented, too personal, too much like listening to someone think out loud rather than receiving carefully worked out arguments. Religious readers split along predictable lines. Jansenists embraced it as vindication. Jesuits criticised it as dangerous. Protestants read it with interest, seeing in Pascal's emphasis on grace something close to their own theology. Skeptics dismissed it as the final ravings of a genius destroyed by religious mania. But certain passages caught fire. The wager spread through intellectual circles, generating debate that continues to this day. The passages on human nature, on our capacity for both greatness and misery, resonated with readers who'd never heard of Jansenism and didn't care about theological controversies. The FRA commence on distraction, on how we fill our lives with entertainment to avoid confronting existence, felt prophetic, as if Pascal had seen something about human nature that was only becoming clearer with time, and the mystical passages, especially once people learned about the memorial, took on an eerie power. Here was someone who'd claimed direct experience of the divine, not visions or voices, but certainty, the kind of certainty that mathematicians feel when they complete a proof. Applied to God, was he deluded, enlightened, both? The text couldn't answer that question. It could only present the fragments and let readers decide. Different eras found different things in Pascal. The Enlightenment philosophers were fascinated by his mathematical work, but uncomfortable with his mysticism. The Romantics loved his intensity, his willingness to follow experience beyond reason. The existentialists recognized a kindred spirit, someone who'd confronted the absurdity of existence without flinching. Modern readers often discover him through the wager, then work backwards to the rest, finding to their surprise that the man who formulated that coldly logical argument was also a mystic who sewed a record of religious ecstasy into his clothing. The contradictions that seemed to tear Pascal apart in life become in retrospect the source of his continuing relevance. Because most people live with similar contradictions. We want certainty but doubt everything. We crave meaning but can't prove it exists. We're drawn to transcendence but trapped in matter. Pascal didn't resolve these tensions, lived them with an intensity that ultimately destroyed him. But in doing so, he mapped the territory, showed what it looks like to take both reason and faith seriously, to refuse easy answers from either direction. His influence extended in unexpected directions. Computer scientists named a programming language after him, recognizing his pioneering work in calculating machines. Physicists use his name for units of pressure, honoring his barometric experiments. Mathematicians still study Pascal's triangle and his work on probability, but it's the pensées that made him immortal. That collection of fragments continues to challenge, provoke, and inspire. Not because Pascal had all the answers, but because he asked the right questions, and because he demonstrated that brilliant minds don't have to choose between rigorous thinking and profound feeling, between scientific precision and mystical experience, between the world we can measure and the world we can only sense. He tried to hold both together, and it killed him. But the attempt was worth making, and the record he left behind proves that it's possible, at least briefly, to stand in both worlds at once, to be fully rational and fully faithful, fully skeptical and fully certain, fully human in all the contradictory glory that entails. The Port Royal community gradually dispersed after Pascal's death. Persecution intensified under Louis XIV. The buildings were eventually destroyed, the movement suppressed. But Pascal's defense of them ensured their ideas survived. His provincial letters remained in circulation, despite being officially banned, copied and passed from hand to hand, read in secret, their wit and clarity making Jansenist theology accessible to people who would never have read theological treatises. The Jesuits eventually won the political battle, but lost the intellectual war. Pascal's mockery of their casuistry stuck. His portrayal of them as moral relativists willing to excuse any sin if it benefited the powerful became the standard view. It took centuries for their reputation to recover. And even today, mention casuistry, and many people think of Pascal's devastating satire. This was the power of his prose. He could make complex theological arguments accessible through humour and narrative, could turn abstract principles into vivid characters, could write with such clarity that his targets never reckoned. The mathematician who'd proven theorems turned out to be equally skilled at proving points, at constructing arguments so airtight that opponents could only sputter in response, at finding the perfect phrase that would lodge in readers' memories and shape their thinking forever. All while dying, all while his body betrayed him year after year, all while enduring pain that would have silenced most people. The work was both his refuge from suffering and perhaps its cause. He pushed himself beyond what any body could sustain, worked when he should have rested, thought when he should have slept, poured everything into the fragments that would become the pensée, knowing he was dying, knowing the clock was running out, trying desperately to get it all down before the darkness came. And then it came. August 19th, 1662. Pascal was 39 years old. The pain had become unbearable. Convulsions racked his body. He couldn't speak, couldn't write, could barely think through the agony. His sister, Gilberte, stayed with him through the final days, watched him suffer, saw the brilliant mind trapped in a failing body. He received the last rites, asked for communion, managed to whisper that he wished he could die in Port Royal among the faithful. But he was too weak to be moved. On that August morning, the end came. Not peacefully, not with final profound words. Just a man dying hard after a life lived harder. The body that had tormented him for decades finally gave out. The mind that had revolutionized mathematics, transformed physics, and challenged theology went dark. He left Behi, and a mess, fragments scattered across his room, notes written on scraps of paper, ideas half-developed, arguments incomplete. The great work he'd planned to write defending Christianity existed only in pieces. No structure, no order, just hundreds of thoughts pinned to sheets and stuffed in drawers. His family gathered the fragments, tried to make sense of them, published them 8 years later as the Pensées, Thoughts, the book he never finished, the defense of faith constructed from ruins. And it worked. Those fragments proved more powerful than any systematic treatise could have been, because they captured something essential about the human condition, the incompleteness, the contradictions, the sense that we're always grasping for something just beyond reach. Pascal's unfinished book, B, became his masterpiece precisely because it was unfinished. It mirrored the human experience. We're all working with incomplete information, all trying to construct meaning from fragments, all dying before we figure everything out. The Pensée doesn't give you a complete system. It gives you a mind wrestling with ultimate questions and refusing to pretend the answers are simple, refusing to choose between reason and faith when both seem necessary, refusing to settle for comfort when truth demands more. This is why Pascal still matters, not because he solved the problem of how to reconcile science and religion. He didn't. Not because he proved God exists. He couldn't. Not because he found a way to live without contradiction. He failed. He matters because he showed what intellectual honesty looks like, what it costs to refuse easy answers, what happens when you take both reason and faith seriously enough to let them tear you apart. Most thinkers choose a side. Pascal tried to hold both, tried to be simultaneously the mathematician who demanded proof and the mystic who experienced God directly, the scientist who measured pressure, and the believer who wore a memorial to a mystical encounter sewn into his coat. The result was productive tension, creative friction, work that still feels alive centuries later because it never resolved into comfortable certainty. Read the Pensées today and you encounter a mind in motion, arguments that circle back on themselves, insights that contradict each other, moments of brilliant clarity followed by admissions of confusion. It's messy, it's human, it's real in a way that systematic philosophy often isn't. Pascal's wager remains his most famous contribution to religious thought. But it's often misunderstood. Critics treat it as a cynical calculation, believe in God because the payoff is good and the risk is low. This misses the depth. Pascal wasn't arguing for fake belief. He was arguing that we all make bets whether we realize it or not, that refusing to choose is itself a choice, that we can't wait for certainty before committing. The wager is really about recognizing our situation. We're finite beings facing infinite questions. We have to act without complete information. We have to stake our lives on something. The question isn't whether to bet, it's what to bet on. And Pascal argues we should bet on the possibility that give our lives maximum meaning. That transforms suffering into something bearable. That makes sense of our deepest intuitions about justice and love and purpose, not because we can prove it true, but because we have to live as if something is true, and this seems like the best option given what's at stake. This was existentialism before the term existed. Kierkegaard would later develop similar ideas about the leap of faith. Dostoevsky would explore the same terrain in his novels. Camus would wrestle with meaning in an absurd universe. They were all working Pascal's ground, confronting the same basic problem. How do we live when we can't prove what matters most? Pascal's answer was complex. Yes, believe, but not blindly. Investigate, study, examine the evidence, use your reason as far as it will take you. Then recognize its limits. Acknowledge that some truths might only be accessible through experience, through the heart which has its reasons that reason doesn't know. This isn't anti-intellectual. It's recognizing that intelligence has boundaries, that some questions can't be answered by calculation alone, that a purely rational life might miss something essential. His scientific work reinforced this paradox. He'd proven that vacuums exist through careful experimentation, had demonstrated that air has weight, that pressure varies with altitude, had used mathematics to describe physical reality with precision. All of this showed reason's power, but it also showed its limits. Science could tell you how things work, it couldn't tell you why they exist, could measure pressure but not purpose, could predict outcomes but not assign meaning. You needed both, the calculating mind and the intuitive heart, the experimental method and the mystical vision. Pascal tried to be both simultaneously, and it broke him, but it also made him see further than others who stayed safely on one side or the other. His influence on mathematics alone would have secured his legacy. Pascal's triangle, Pascal's theorem, his work on probability, his contribution to calculus through his work on infinitesimals. Each of these advanced the field significantly. Computer scientists recognize him as a pioneer. His mechanical calculator was a genuine breakthrough. His understanding of algorithms and procedures anticipated modern programming. The Pascal programming language, developed in the 1970s, honors this legacy, but it's his theological and philosophical work that keeps him read. The Pensée sells more copies now than any of his mathematical papers, because the questions he asked haven't gone away. Maybe they've become more urgent. We live in an age of incredible scientific advancement. We can manipulate genes, explore space, build artificial intelligence. Our technical capabilities grow exponentially, yet the basic human questions remain unanswered. What does it mean to live well? How should we face death? Is there purpose or only process? Does suffering mean something, or is it just neurons firing? Pascal faced these questions without modern science's answers, but also without its distractions. He couldn't hide behind technological progress or evolutionary explanations. He had to confront existence directly. And what he found was contradiction. We're magnificent and pathetic, capable of understanding the universe and incapable of understanding ourselves. Hungry for meaning and unable to prove it exists. Desperate for certainty and condemned to doubt the greatness and wretchedness of man. This was his constant theme. We're not simply good or evil, rational or emotional, spiritual or material. We're all of it tangled together. Any philosophy that ignores half of human nature gets it wrong. Any religion that denies reason is incomplete. Any science that dismisses the spiritual misses something real. Pascal refused to simplify, refused to choose between contradictory truths, held them both even when it hurt, especially when it hurt, because the contradiction itself might be the truth, might be what it means to be human, caught between earth and heaven, between animal instinct and divine aspiration, between the finite and the infinite. His death at 39 seems tragic. All that brilliance extinguished, all that potential unfulfilled. The great systematic defense of Christianity never written. The mathematical discoveries never made. The inventions never completed. But perhaps he lived exactly as long as necessary. Long enough to map the territory, to show what it looks like when someone refuses easy answers, to demonstrate that intellectual honesty sometimes means living with unresolved tension. He didn't solve the problem of faith and reason. He showed us the problem in all its complexity, showed us what we lose when we pretend it's simple. The memorial sewn into his coat was found after his death, that scrap of parchment with its record of the night of fire, the night God became real to him, beyond argument or proof. He carried it with him for 8 years. Through all his mathematical work, his scientific experiments, his theological controversies, a private reminder that he'd experienced something reason couldn't capture, something that made all the calculations and proof seem secondary. This wasn't irrationalism. He never stopped thinking, never stopped demanding evidence and logical coherence, but he'd learned that some truths announce themselves differently, that experiencing God might be like experiencing beauty or love, something you know directly but can't quite explain. The Port Royal community remembered him as a defender of their cause. The Jesuits remembered him as a dangerous opponent. The scientific community remembered him as a brilliant mathematician. None of them saw the whole picture. He was all of these, and the contradictions between them weren't failures, they were the point, showing that a human life can encompass more than any single category, that you can be rigorously logical and deeply mystical, that faith doesn't require abandoning intelligence, and intelligence doesn't require abandoning faith. The fragments of the Pensée continue to provoke. Each generation finds something new. Existentialists claimed him. Christians quote him. Skeptics wrestle with his arguments. Everyone recognizes something true, even when they disagree with his conclusions. Because Pascal wrote about the human condition with une common honesty. He didn't pretend to have everything figured out, didn't offer false comfort or easy certainty, just said, here's what I see, here's what I've experienced, here's what reason shows me, and here's where reason fails. Make of it what you will. His legacy is permission. Permission to think hard without losing faith. Permission to believe deeply without abandoning reason. Permission to acknowledge that life contains genuine paradoxes that can't be resolved by choosing one side. We're still living in the world Pascal described, still caught between what we can prove and what we intuit, still trying to make meaning in a universe that science describes but doesn't explain, still wondering if there's more than mechanism, more than survival and reproduction, more than neurons and void. Pascal says yes, but not cheaply, not through wishful thinking or intellectual laziness, through rigorous thought that acknowledges its own limits, through faith that doesn't fear questions, through a life lived with both eyes open, seeing the mathematical elegance of pressure and barometers, seeing the mystical reality of fire and transformation, refusing to pretend either vision is complete. The calculating machine he built sits in museums now, a curiosity, a historical artifact. But the questions he asked remain, urgent, unanswered, unavoidable. That's what makes him immortal. Not the theorems or the inventions, the willingness to stand in the tension, to refuse the comfort of certainty when honesty demands doubt, to refuse the comfort of doubt when experience demands faith, to be whom, and in the fullest sense, rational and mystical, scientific and spiritual, dying and seeking, right up to the end. He died at 39, brilliant, broken, leaving behind fragments of an unfinished masterpiece. The apology he'd planned to write defending Christianity remained scattered across hundreds of scraps of paper. No structure, no clear argument, just pieces of a mind that had seen too much to settle for easy answers. His family found the memorial sewn into his coat, that record of the night when everything changed, when fire became more real than logic, when the God of Abraham replaced the God of the philosophers. He carried it next to his heart for 8 years, through all the mathematics and physics and theological battles. A private reminder that certainty sometimes comes from places reason can't reach. The Pensées were published 8 years after his death, edited, organised, incomplete, and they became more influential than any finished systematic work could have been, because the fragments captured something systematic philosophy misses: the actual texture of thinking, the contradictions we live with, the questions that won't resolve no matter how hard we push. Pascal's wager is what most people remember, that coldly logical argument about betting on God's existence, but it's a fragment torn from context. The real Pascal was the mystic who recorded his experience of divine fire, the mathematician who proved vacuums exist, the inventor who designed calculating machines and public transportation, the controversialist who destroyed the Jesuits' reputation with satirical brilliance, the dying man who gave everything away and lived his final months in deliberate poverty. All of these at once, refusing to choose between reason and intuition, between science and mysticism, between calculation and encounter. The refusal killed him, but it also made him see what others missed. That human beings are contradictions, that we contain multitudes, that any philosophy pretending otherwise is a lie. He matters because we're still caught in the same tensions. Our science is vastly more powerful than anything Pascal imagined. We can sequence genomes, explore distant planets, build artificial minds. But the basic questions remain. What does it mean to live well? How should we face death? Is there purpose or just process? Does consciousness point to something beyond neurons? Is there meaning to discover or only meaning to invent? Pascal said yes to meaning, but not through wishful thinking, through rigorous examination of what it feels like to be human, through acknowledging both our capacity for greatness and our tendency toward wretchedness, through recognizing that we're thinking reeds crushed by a universe that doesn't notice us yet, somehow capable of understanding our own crushing. The memorial lies preserved now, a piece of parchment covered in hurried handwriting. Fire, certainty, joy, peace, the God of Jesus Christ, not of the philosophers. Words trying to capture something that exceeded language, an experience that couldn't be proven but felt more real than anything else. Was he right? Did he encounter God that night, or experience a psychological state his mind interpreted as divine? The question can't be answered by examining evidence. Each person decides based on their own encounters or lack thereof, based on whether the universe feels like mechanism only or like something more. What's certain is the transformation itself, the trajectory from promising young mathematician to mystical defender of faith, from comfortable intellectual to man consumed by questions that had no comfortable answers. That change was real. Its effects ripple still. Computer scientists use his name. Physicists use his units. Mathematicians study his triangle and his probability theory. But it's the fragments that made him immortal. Those incomplete thoughts about human nature and divine hiddenness. About the heart's reasons that reason doesn't know. About distraction and despair and the wager we can't avoid making. He showed what intellectual honesty costs, what it looks like to refuse easy answers from either religious or secular camps, to insist on holding contradictions in tension rather than resolving them prematurely, to acknowledge limits without surrendering the search for truth. Most thinkers choose sides. Pascal tried to inhabit both, tried to be simultaneously the scientist demanding proof and the mystic recording divine encounter. The result was productive friction, work that still feels alive because it never settled into comfortable certainty. Read the Pensées and you encounter a mind refusing to rest, arguments that double back, insights that contradict previous insights, moments of clarity followed by admissions of confusion. It's messy, it's human, it's honest in ways systematic philosophy often isn't. He died before finishing, before resolving the tensions, before writing the great systematic defense he'd planned. But perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps the incompleteness is the message, that we're all working with fragments, all trying to construct meaning from pieces, all dying before we figure everything out. The calculating machine sits in museums. The barometric experiments are textbook history. The provincial letters are read mainly by specialists. But the wager persists. The observations about human nature feel contemporary. The acknowledgement that we're caught between two infinities still resonates. Because Pascal described something permanent, the strangeness of being conscious in an indifferent cosmos, the simultaneous pull toward meaning and meaninglessness, the inability to prove what matters most, yet the necessity of living as if something matters. He wagered everything on that necessity. Abandoned comfortable intellectual life for austere spirituality, gave away his wealth, accepted suffering, pushed himself to exhaustion in service of articulating what he'd experienced. The night of fire justified it all, made everything else secondary. Whether that justification was real or illusory, each person determines for themselves. But the intensity was real. The commitment was real. The willingness to sacrifice everything for what he believed was truth. That kind of radical seriousness is rare. Most of us hedge our bets, keep options open, live in comfortable ambiguity. Pascal couldn't do that. Once he'd experienced what he experienced, halfway measures became impossible. Either it was real and demanded everything, or it was delusion and demanded abandonment. He chose reality, chose to trust the experience even when it cost him career and health and life. The Port Royal community dispersed. The Jansenist movement was suppressed. The controversies that consumed Pascal's final years faded into historical footnotes, but his witness survived. The record of someone who took both reason and revelation seriously, who refused to pretend contradictions were simple, who lived the tension until it killed him. 3.5 centuries later, we're still reading the fragments, still arguing about the wager, still recognizing ourselves in his descriptions of human nature, still wondering if the God he encountered was real, or if consciousness produces convincing illusions we mistake for transcendence. The questions don't resolve. They can't. They're the permanent questions of being human, aware of our finitude, yet reaching for infinity, capable of mathematics and mysticism, calculating pressure and experiencing fire, living in bodies that betray us while minds seek what bodies can't contain. Pascal mapped that territory, showed what it looks like when someone explores it honestly, without pretending it's simpler than it is, without choosing between contradictory truths that both seem real. He failed to build the system he intended, failed to write the complete defense, failed to reconcile all the tensions, but the failure itself became his legacy, proving that some truths can't be captured in systems. That genuine inquiry sometimes means living with unresolved questions. That intellectual honesty requires acknowledging what we don't know as clearly as what we do. The memorial sewn into his coat was his final answer. Not an argument, but a testimony. Not proof, but witness. Something happened that night. Something that made everything else secondary. Something he couldn't explain but couldn't deny. He spent 8 years trying to articulate it, trying to build bridges between that experience and the rational world, trying to show that mysticism and mathematics weren't enemies, but different ways of encountering reality. He didn't succeed completely, but he showed the attempt was worth making. That's enough. That's everything. A life lived with both eyes open, seeing what reason reveals and what reason misses, refusing comfort when truth demands more, standing in the fire until it consumed him. The fragments remain, incomplete, contradictory, alive, still asking the questions that matter, still refusing easy answers, still pointing towards something beyond what can be calculated or measured or proven, still burning.